Welcome to the debate. We are diving into a really crucial period of American history today, the post-World War II era. This is when massive investment and new tools like standardized testing really transformed the U.S. intellectual landscape. And this period, well, it solidified the global dominance of elite gatekeepers like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton.
It really did. And the stunning paradox here is that this entire architecture, which was, built on the promise of meritocracy, this idea that talent alone should dictate success, has completely coincided with an explosion of, national dysfunction, massive inequality, the collapse of social mobility, and deep political polarization. It's quite striking.
Absolutely. And that paradox, it brings us right to our central question, really, the question of causality. Did the structure of American elite meritocracy itself fundamentally fail? Did it become the primary source of this current crisis, the soaring inequality, the leadership vacuum we see? Or are these negative outcomes maybe the unfortunate result of overwhelming external economic forces that the system, flawed as it might be, has simply been unable to survive?
Well, I believe we absolutely must maintain a distinction there. The structure for identifying and, yes, rewarding talent is, I think, presently overwhelmed, maybe even corrupted, you could say, by a crushing external economic context. That's where I argue the primary failure really lies.
And I'm going to argue the opposite, that the structural mechanisms of elite meritocracy itself, the relentless focus on exclusive admissions, the massive accumulation of wealth, these huge endowments, and the resulting elite networking, that these are the primary drivers of this failure. The system, I believe, is designed maybe inherently to perpetuate privilege.
Okay, I have to challenge that premise almost immediately. When we talk about the core metrics of failure, and they are stark, right? The fact that social mobility has plummeted, or that the top 1% controls most national assets, these feel much more like symptoms of a colossal economic breakdown, one that's driven by stagnant wages and, frankly, skyrocketing costs, especially for education. I think we might be confusing the mechanism of educational selection with the overarching failure of the economy to sustain genuine opportunity for everyone.
I think that view fundamentally misinterprets, or at least underestimates, the role of institutional power. I mean, look at the shift the material itself describes. In 1940, what was it? Only 5% of American men attended college. Today, that number is around 35%. Now, this explosion of educational attainment, it should have democratized opportunities, shouldn't it? Logically, it should have lowered the Gini coefficient, reduced inequality. Instead, the exact opposite happened. Inequality worsened dramatically. Why? I argue it's because the institutional machinery is designed precisely to concentrate power, not diffuse it. These elite universities, they hoard applicants, they amass endowments that rival small nations, and then they produce this overwhelming majority of our leadership, CEOs, judges, senators. That is a structure built for concentration.
The machinery certainly concentrates leadership. I won't argue that point. But we really need to ask what drove the crushing urgency to get into those top institutions in the first place. I mean, the initial post-World War II success, where academic power truly did translate into upward mobility for many, that shows the potential of the system, right? When the economic fundamentals were sounder. The problem today feels overwhelmingly financial. Just consider the student debt crisis. Tuition rose steeply, often because state funding retreated and, yes, costs soared. But wages just flatlined for decades for most people. And what's more, student loans are uniquely devastating in the US. They generally can't be discharged in bankruptcy. So this financial structure, it makes elite education an unaffordable necessity for success, not merely a fair reward for talent.
And that seems to me like a legal and financial structural failure that really transcends the academic achievement criteria.
I struggle to separate those financial burdens from the structure itself, though. To me, they feel like two sides of the same exclusive coin. The system of elite gatekeeping, I believe, actively reinforces the concentration of wealth. If meritocracy were truly working as intended, that massive expansion of college attendance would have reversed, or at least slowed inequality. Instead, it accelerated it. I believe the system is rigged, not necessarily by some shadowy outside force, but by the very mechanisms, like standardized testing, institutionalized by figures like James Conant and Henry Chauncey. These tools were designed to cement institutional power over genuine mobility. These gatekeepers, they determine the structure, and that structure ensures the ultimate payoff. The prestige, the networking, is directly correlated with the institution's exclusive brand power. That makes it exclusionary almost by definition.
But you are making, I think, a critical mistake on causality there. You seem to confuse a system that's reacting to tremendous economic pressure, like the necessity of high tuition because of external fiscal issues, with a system that is somehow causing the fundamental economic pressure of wage stagnation itself. The core injustice today isn't just the difficulty of admission, although that's part of it. It's that achieving this kind of meritocracy success has become both mandatory and financially crippling for so many. That necessity, that desperation, is driven by the erosion of working class and middle class wages over decades. That feels like an external economic failure, not primarily a fault of the selection process itself.
But I have to challenge that premise. The selection process, the institutions are complicit in the economic failure. These institutions, with their massive wealth, their endowments in the billions, they are economic power players. They actively engage in lobbying. They influence financial policies that protect their class, protect their endowment returns. They are not just passive recipients of external economic pressure. They benefit from, and I argue they reinforce, the very system of wealth concentration.
Okay, let's maybe transition then to the resulting leadership, because I think this gets to the heart of the dysfunction we're seeing. You highlight the problem as one of exclusive networks, like Yale's Skull and Bones. And you point out quite pointedly that both Bush and Kerry in 2004 belonged to the same secret society. You argue this illustrates the reinforcement of a, quote, rigged game, ensuring leaders remain disconnected.
Precisely. That homogeneity, that shared background and viewpoint, is a structural failure of socialization within the meritocratic framework itself. The network ensures the closed loop remains, well, pretty impenetrable.
Right, I see that. While those elite networks certainly can amplify the problem of disconnection, I'd argue the real issue might be the type of leader being selected and rewarded by the current hyper-competitive environment. If the meritocracy was truly selecting for the best, most creative, most empathetic minds, maybe those networks would be less toxic, you know? Instead, the ruthless pursuit of grades, of credentials, often over genuine learning, fosters what the source material aptly describes as soulless leadership. Think about the counterexample provided in the material. Johnny Kim, the so-called perfect meritocrat, Navy SEAL, then Harvard doctor, then NASA astronaut. I mean, his achievement is absolutely staggering, no question. Yet he's presented as potentially representing a hollow form of success, hyper-competent, utterly ambitious, yes, but perhaps lacking the original ideas, the deep thinking necessary to solve complex systemic problems. The structure arguably selects for this kind of robotic achievement and credentialism. It prioritizes quantifiable success over genuine insight or wisdom. And that lack of imagination and leadership, like the inability to fundamentally solve the 2008 crisis, for instance, feels like an internal selection flaw, separate from whether or not the leader happened to be in a secret club at Yale.
That's a compelling argument about the selection criteria maybe favoring efficiency over originality. I grant you that. But I see the network and the selection flaw as mutually reinforcing. They work together. The result is, I think, systemic corruption. I mean, look at the Obama case study presented. A Harvard law graduate came into office promising major reform after 2008. Instead of really challenging the system, what does he do? He immediately appoints Larry Summers, another Harvard insider deeply linked to the financial crisis itself, to manage the Wall Street rescue. Now that decision, which demonstrably worsened public distrust while ordinary homeowners suffered immensely, that's not just a failure of selection, like picking the wrong person. It's clear evidence of Wall Street and political elites protecting their own kind. It's the closed loop in action. And that loop is defined by shared institutional background and, yes, those networks.
That evidence regarding the aftermath of 2008 is strong, I agree. It does show how institutional homogeneity can breed policy protectionism. But we need to step back again and look at how we define systemic failure.
The political dysfunction you cite, the polarization, the rise of populism, isn't it often better understood as a reaction? A reaction to external, visceral economic anxiety, especially among those people in communities completely left behind by globalization and decades of wage stagnation. I mean, take someone like J.D. Vance, for example. The Meritocracy absolutely identified his talent. He was admitted to Yale Law School, wrote Hillbilly Elegy, a very successful book. His political opportunism afterwards, initially opposing Trump and then very publicly aligning with him, maybe that illustrates elite maneuvering in response to the political crisis. His behavior seems like a symptom of a highly toxic, economically polarized climate, not necessarily proof that the system inherently failed to identify talent. The meritocracy found him. Arguably, the political environment then corrupted him.
I disagree fundamentally on the emphasis there. We are talking about something deeper. I think a generational betrayal. The true failure isn't just a political squabble or polarization numbers, it's the total collapse of the American dream for so many. This isn't just polarization, it's systemic corruption, where the structure produces leaders who consistently prioritize protecting their own class, ensuring that revolving door between government and Wall Street just keeps spinning. When elite institutions prioritize their own endowment growth and their exclusivity over a true public mission, and when the resulting leadership consistently fails to deliver economic justice for the majority, well, that is a structural failure, a failure of accountability rooted in institutional homogeneity. And that failure, I argue, directly drives the very economic anxiety you cite as external.
The challenge, though, remains this. We have to try and isolate the variables, don't we? You describe Wall Street protectionism as a structural failure of meritocracy. I would argue that the economic policies themselves, like deregulation, like tax policies favoring capital, like the policies that led to wage stagnation, those are the root cause of the crisis. And meritocracy is simply the pipeline that delivers the already incentivized, perhaps already corrupted, talent to the top of that flawed economic system. So is the failure that the system selects for achievement, or is the failure that the broader economy ensures only a tiny fraction of society can realistically afford to pursue that achievement and reap its rewards? I still argue the latter is the overwhelming driver.
But that's exactly where I insist that the institution of elite meritocracy is deeply intertwined with financial policy. When a single university holds an endowment exceeding $40 billion, it is fundamentally an economic power player. Its very exclusivity, its constant accumulation of assets, reinforces the vast inequality that the system was, at least ostensibly, designed to combat. That massive wealth almost requires exclusivity to justify its existence and its tax-exempt status.
Okay, I understand the deep skepticism regarding institutional wealth. And frankly, much of it is warranted. But while things like admissions reform and seriously addressing institutional wealth accumulation are necessary conversations, I still believe the root solution to the collapsed Gini coefficient, to the core inequality, lies more in federal financial regulation, tax policy, and policies promoting fundamental wage growth across the board, which are primarily external economic levers outside the direct control of university admissions offices.
This is clearly a complex disagreement, but I think we've certainly illuminated the core tension in the material. My position, to summarize, remains that the concentration of power, wealth, and influence within these exclusive, elite institutions and their resulting closed network structures are the fundamental, structural drivers of our current inequality and political dysfunction. And in that sense, the system has profoundly failed in its core promise of merit-based mobility.
And I maintain that while the negative outcomes, severe inequality, a disappointingly narrow leadership class, are undeniably real and deeply concerning, they are overwhelmingly exacerbated by stagnant wages and broader financial policy failures that either predate or operate parallel to the meritocratic framework. We have to draw, I think, a crucial distinction between the ideal of rewarding talent and the deeply corrupted economic environment it is currently forced to operate within.
The evidence we've discussed certainly forces us to consider whether these institutional structures, originally designed perhaps to foster talent, are now, paradoxically, acting as the primary engines of privilege in this nation.
And perhaps whether true progress demands we address both the internal failures of the selection process and the broad external economic stagnation simultaneously. It's likely not an either-or situation. Thank you for this discussion.